I never thought failing one test could change my life so completely. I walked into Ms. Hargrove's classroom that Monday morning, expecting the usual size and a lecture about my terrible grades. I had been skating by all semester, distracted, careless, convinced I could coast through without actually learning anything. But Ms. Hargrove, who everyone called strict but fair, had other plans for me. I slid into my usual seat at the back, avoiding eye contact, trying to make myself invisible as she prepared her notes at the front. She looked at me like she could see through every excuse I had ever made, and I immediately felt a shiver down my spine. "Jason," she said, her voice sharp but calm. Everyone turned to look at me. My stomach dropped. "You're failing again." Not surprising, but disappointing. "I've been patient. I've given you chances. Clearly, that isn't enough." She paused, scanning the room. "I think we need a new approach." My mind raced. Detention, extra homework, tutoring, whatever it was, I was ready to endure it. But then she said something I didn't expect. "You're going to attend school as a girl until your grades improve." I blinked. I thought I misheard her. "Excuse me?" She didn't hesitate. "You'll wear the clothes I provide, act like a girl in class, and meet all my expectations. When your grades show improvement, the arrangement ends. Until then, this is your new routine." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. But her eyes told me it wasn't. The way she held herself, the calm authority in her voice, it was final. I had no choice but to follow her instructions. The first day was the worst. She handed me a small bundle of clothes, a skirt, a blouse, tights, and flats. My hands shook as I touched them, feeling the strange texture, the unfamiliar weight of the skirt in my fingers. I had never imagined myself wearing anything like this, and yet here I was, standing in the bathroom, changing into a version of myself that felt alien and frightening. I caught a glimpse in the mirror. My reflection looked unfamiliar, softer, smaller somehow. I tried to smile, but it was forced, awkward, and uncomfortable. Walking back into class was unbearable. Every step felt like it echoed through the room. My classmates stared, some openly smirking, others whispering. I felt my face burn. Ms. Hargrove didn't say a word to the class about it, only gave me a small nod of acknowledgement as I took my seat. The silence was heavier than any teasing I could imagine. I felt exposed in a way I had never experienced. The first week was agony. Each day, I learned to adjust a little more. How to walk without tripping over the skirt, how to sit with my knees together, how to keep my voice steady when called on. I hated every second, but I had to remind myself this was temporary. At least, I kept repeating that to myself. But then something strange happened. I started noticing how clothes could change the way people saw me, and how I saw myself. My posture became more conscious, my movements more careful. People treated me differently, not cruelly, but differently. There was a subtle curiosity in their eyes, a mix of surprise and intrigue. I realized that the person I presented wasn't entirely fake. There was a version of me in this body, in these clothes, that existed and reacted, that felt the world in a slightly new way. Ms. Hargrove was relentless. She didn't just care about appearances. She demanded focus, attention, engagement. She would call on me in ways she never had before, making me explain concepts out loud, solve problems on the board, and participate fully. She critiqued my posture, my handwriting, my speech, everything. At first, it was humiliating. But over time, I started to notice I was learning things I never had before. My grades improved, slowly but steadily. I was forced to pay attention in ways I never had. There were moments I almost wanted to quit. A group of classmates tried to push me out of my comfort zone, teasing me relentlessly, daring me to run home in tears. But every time I felt like breaking, Miss Hargrove's eyes would find mine. No cruelty, just unwavering expectation. It was as if she could see the exact point where I would crumble and nudged me past it. I started to understand that she wanted more than just good grades. She wanted growth, discipline, resilience. One afternoon, she pulled me aside after class. "You're improving," she said quietly, almost like she was letting me in on a secret. "But it's not just about the numbers on a paper, Jason. You're learning who you are when you're uncomfortable. That's more valuable than any grade. Her words lingered in my mind. I realized she was right. The boy who had walked in on that first Monday, defiant and lazy, no longer existed in the same way. I was quieter now, more deliberate, more aware of how I moved, how I spoke, how I presented myself. And yes, part of me had started to like this version of myself. It scared me. It thrilled me. It made me question everything I thought I knew about who I was. Weeks passed. My grades climbed steadily. I was still dressed as a girl every day, still learning to move, speak, and act with a grace I had never cultivated. But the teasing had lessened. My classmates started treating me differently, almost respectfully. I realized I had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had learned patience, humility, and self-awareness. The day Ms. Hargrove finally said my grades had improved enough for me to return to my usual wardrobe was surreal. I looked at the pile of clothes I had grown used to, even fond of, and felt a pang of loss. Part of me had come to identify with this version of myself, and letting it go felt like saying goodbye to a friend. I dressed back in my old clothes with a strange mix of relief and nostalgia. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the same face, but it was different somehow. The reflection was steadier, more confident, more aware. I realized that the boy who had failed so miserably had grown into someone stronger, someone who had learned to endure discomfort and come out the other side. Ms. Hargrove didn't make a show of it. She didn't say, "See what I told you?" She simply nodded, satisfied, and went back to her notes. But I knew I had been changed in ways that grades could never fully measure. I had discovered resilience, self-awareness, and the strange thrill of transformation not just in appearance, but in identity. Months later, I still thought about that first day, the fear, the humiliation, and the unexpected growth. I realized that being forced into that role, into that discomfort, had taught me more about myself than any lecture or textbook ever could. I had learned that identity was fluid, that courage came from vulnerability, and that sometimes the hardest lessons were also the most transformative. I didn't tell anyone the full story. It wasn't something I could explain easily. People might not understand, might laugh, or dismiss it. But I carried it with me. In subtle ways, it shaped how I approached the world. I walked taller, spoke clearer, and listened better. I approached challenges with a patience I never had. And every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and see traces of that version of me, the version who had walked timidly back into class in a skirt and blouse, and I would smile. It wasn't just about dressing as a girl, or about grades, or about obedience. It was about growth, about seeing yourself through a lens of discomfort and coming out stronger on the other side. It was about learning who you could be when you were forced to adapt, forced to reflect, forced to truly confront yourself. And I knew that no matter where life took me, that lesson would stay with me forever. The experience changed how I saw the world, how I saw people, and how I saw myself. I had been humbled, challenged, and ultimately transformed. What started as punishment ended as revelation, and what I learned about identity, courage, and adaptability became the foundation of who I would become. Ms. Hargrove never needed to pat me on the back or give me praise. The change was visible, undeniable, and permanent. Even now, when I sit quietly and think back to that Monday, I remember the fear, the uncertainty, the embarrassment, and the strange exhilaration that came with wearing clothes that weren't mine. I remember feeling like I had no control, and yet somehow gaining a sense of self I never knew I could possess. I realized that sometimes being forced to see yourself differently is the only way to truly understand who you are. And in that strange, uncomfortable, transformative time, I discovered a strength, a grace, and a resilience that would carry me far beyond the walls of Ms. Hargrove's classroom. After that semester ended, returning to my usual wardrobe felt both liberating and strangely hollow. The skirt, the blouse, the tights, they were gone, but the memory of them lingered, tucked into my movements, the way I carried myself. At first, I tried to ignore it, pretending I was back to my old self, the Jason who skipped homework and cared little about appearances. But I quickly realized that old habits didn't fit anymore. The version of me who had walked into class with trembling hands, dressed in unfamiliar clothes, had left an imprint I couldn't erase. I noticed it first in small ways. I adjusted my posture automatically when I sat at a desk, no one telling me to. I chose my words more carefully when speaking to teachers or classmates. I found myself empathizing with classmates I had once ignored, seeing their insecurities, their quiet struggles. It was as if wearing those clothes, performing that role, had stretched some invisible part of me, like muscles I never knew existed, and now I could feel them shaping who I was. People around me began to notice. Friends commented that I seemed different, more grounded, more self-aware. They didn't know what had happened, of course, and I couldn't exactly tell them. Who would understand that being forced into a skirt and blouse could teach you courage, patience, and self-reflection? Still, the subtle respect I received felt satisfying, like confirmation that the transformation had been more than superficial. Ms. Hargrove checked in with me occasionally after grades were finalized. "How's life outside of class?" she asked once, a faint smile on her face. I hesitated, then told her the truth, at least partially, that I was learning to carry myself differently, to take responsibilities seriously, to notice things I had overlooked before. She nodded, as if she had expected this, and said simply, "Good. That's the point. Growth isn't about the grades, it's about what you do with what you've learned." I started paying more attention to my appearance in general, not because anyone demanded it, but because I had developed a curiosity about identity and presentation. I experimented with style, with the way I moved, with small expressions of personality in my clothing and gestures. I wasn't dressing as a girl anymore, but the lessons of awareness, control, and confidence carried over. People called it maturity, but I knew it had roots in something far stranger, a semester of being someone I never imagined myself to be. Socially, things shifted too. Some classmates who had teased me earlier now seemed to respect me, or at least treat me with cautious politeness. The dynamic had changed, subtly but permanently. I realized that vulnerability, even extreme vulnerability, could lead to connection. I had been terrified in that skirt, exposed and anxious, and yet that very exposure had taught me courage I could never have learned sitting at the back of class as a boy who didn't care. One day, months later, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting a simple jacket. I smiled faintly. The person looking back at me was me, but not the same me as before Ms. Hargrove's lesson. There was grace in my posture, steadiness in my gaze, a quiet confidence I hadn't known existed. I remember the first time I had worn the blouse and skirt, trembling and embarrassed, and it felt like a lifetime ago. Yet somehow, that fragile, awkward version of myself had grown into someone capable, self-aware, and surprisingly proud. I thought about the lesson I had learned in a different way. Life would often push me into uncomfortable roles, situations that scared me, that made me question who I was. It could be daunting, humiliating, or frustrating, but if I embraced those moments, reflected on them, and allowed myself to grow, they could become transformative. The experience had taught me to approach challenges with a mindset I had never possessed before. Not fear, not resistance, but curiosity, patience, and courage. I never spoke about the details of that semester with anyone outside Miss Hargrove's class. It wasn't something to brag about, and certainly not something I could explain without misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew it had changed me in ways that grades or awards never could. I carried it quietly, an invisible badge of resilience and self-awareness. And sometimes, late at night, I would remember standing in that bathroom, looking at a reflection I barely recognized, and a strange warmth would rise in my chest. I had survived, adapted, and discovered a strength I didn't know I had. Years later, when I faced moments of uncertainty or fear, presentation nerves, job interviews, first impressions, I would think back to that first Monday with Miss Hargrove, to the skirt and blouse, to the trembling hands and racing heartbeat. And I would smile, because I had faced something far scarier than those moments ever could be, and I had come out stronger. The transformation had started with clothes, yes, but it ended with me. After the school year ended, life didn't simply return to the old normal. My friends treated me differently, not just because of what they thought they had seen in the classroom, but because they sensed a change in me I hadn't even fully realized myself. There was a quiet confidence now in the way I walked down the hallway, a subtle awareness in how I responded to teasing or idle chatter. It was strange when I remembered myself as the slouching, careless boy who never studied. I felt like I was looking at someone else entirely. One afternoon, a few weeks after grades were finalized, I was walking home from school when a group of classmates called me over. They wanted help with an assignment, something trivial, but it felt significant. In the past, they would have ignored me or whispered behind my back. Now, they asked for my input openly. I realized then that respect isn't demanded, it's earned, often in ways you least expect. Later, I ran into a familiar group at the local park. Some of them had been the loudest when I first dressed as a girl in class. I tensed instinctively, expecting ridicule, but instead they looked at me with curiosity mixed with unease. It was subtle, but I understood. The transformation had left traces. I wasn't the boy they thought they knew, and that uncertainty worked in my favor. I spoke to them calmly, engaged naturally, and, for the first time, I felt like I had agency. I could control how the world perceived me, without fear of losing myself. At home, things were changing too. My parents noticed subtle differences in my routine, the care with which I approached schoolwork, the way I spoke about my teachers and friends. They didn't ask many questions, but their expression softened, as if they recognized the growth I had undergone. I didn't tell them about Ms. Hargrove's method, not yet. Part of me wanted to preserve it as a secret, a private victory that belonged entirely to me. Then came the first big challenge outside the school environment, a family gathering. Cousins, neighbors, aunts, and uncles, all the people I had grown up around suddenly noticed the difference in me. Not in a dramatic way, not with words that could embarrass, but in the quiet assessment of posture, tone, and presence. I could feel their eyes scanning me, trying to place what was new. I didn't flinch. I remembered the classroom, the trembling hands, the strange weight of the skirt and blouse, the feeling of being exposed and yet learning to stand tall. I carried that lesson now like armor, invisible but potent. The gathering went surprisingly smoothly. I spoke up in conversations, contributed ideas, and even cracked jokes confidently. I saw nods, smiles, and subtle approvals that I had never earned before. I realized that growth isn't always recognized immediately, but it leaves traces you can't fake. I had been forced to grow in a way that was uncomfortable, even humiliating, and yet those lessons became the foundation of real self-assurance. School resumed in the fall, and with it new challenges. New classmates, different teachers, unfamiliar situations. But I carried the same awareness with me, and it changed how I approached the world. I started tutoring other students, not because I had to, but because I saw the value in helping others navigate their struggles. I remembered the humiliation and vulnerability I had faced and knew how transformative support and guidance could be when offered at the right moment. Sometimes, late at night, I would replay those first days walking into the bathroom, changing into clothes that weren't mine, standing in front of the mirror, and almost not recognizing myself. I would remember the fear, the awkwardness, the embarrassment, and the weight of expectation. And I would smile because I knew that experience had given me tools I could use for the rest of my life. Resilience, empathy, self-awareness, courage, none of which could have been taught with lectures, assignments, or tests alone. I began to think differently about identity. The clothes, the presentation, the role I had been forced to play, it had been a lens into who I could become when I let go of fear. I understood that identity isn't fixed. It's fluid, shaped by experiences, choices, and challenges. Wearing that uniform of someone else's expectation had forced me to confront myself and ultimately emerge stronger, more aware, and more capable of handling life's unpredictable demands. By the time the next school year rolled around, I felt like a new person. Not in an artificial sense, not because I had been molded by someone else, but because I had grown into a version of myself I might never have discovered otherwise. Ms. Hargrove was still teaching, still watching, still demanding excellence. I felt gratitude for her, even though I never said it aloud. She had pushed me in ways that no one else could, And in doing so, she had given me a gift I didn't know I needed: the courage to see myself honestly and the strength to adapt. Even now, when I recall those days, it's not with shame or embarrassment, but with a sense of awe. Who knew that being forced into a role I had resisted so fiercely could teach me more about who I was than all my years of casual living? I had learned to face fear, to embrace discomfort, to observe myself critically, and to adapt gracefully. The lesson wasn't just for school, it was for life. And so I carry it forward. In every challenge, every new situation, every uncertainty, I remember the boy who trembled in the skirt and blouse, the boy who was pushed to grow beyond his comfort zone. I remember the classroom, the mirror, the heavy silence, and the unwavering expectation of a teacher who refused to let me settle for less than my best. I am not that boy anymore. I am stronger, wiser, and more aware of the person I can become. And it all began with a skirt, a blouse, and the courage to face myself honestly. Years passed, and I never forgot that first Monday when Ms. Hargrove changed the course of my life. I had moved on from high school, gone on to college, met new people, faced new challenges, but the lessons from that semester remained, quietly shaping everything I did. I carried the awareness, the resilience, the patience that had been forced into me alongside the skirt and blouse, into every decision, every interaction. Life demanded courage, and I had learned to meet it head-on. I started thinking about identity in ways I never had before. That experience had taught me that who you are is not fixed. It can shift, grow, and expand when you are pushed beyond comfort. I realized that vulnerability is not weakness, and real exposure, is often the fastest path to discovering your strengths. I had been terrified of standing out, of being judged, of looking foolish, but it was precisely those fears that became my teachers. One day, I returned to the old neighborhood for a visit. Walking past my old school, memories flooded back. I could see the classrooms, the hallways, the place where I had first felt utterly exposed and completely raw. I imagined the old version of myself, the boy who had dreaded being called on, who had resisted authority, who had thought grades and appearances didn't matter, and I felt a quiet pride. That boy had survived, adapted, and grown. I smiled, knowing I carried him inside me, strengthened and refined by every trial. I often thought of Ms. Hargrove, wondering if she knew how much her unconventional methods had shaped my life. She had been patient, firm, and unyielding, yet somehow compassionate. She had pushed me to a place I never thought I could reach, and in doing so, she had revealed a resilience in me I didn't know existed. It wasn't just about academics, it was about life, about how to face challenges, how to accept discomfort, how to grow when the world demanded it. As I reflected on those days, I realized that my self-confidence, my empathy, and my awareness were all rooted in that experience. I had learned to observe myself, to reflect on my actions, and to approach challenges with a calm determination. I had learned that discomfort can be a guide, that awkwardness can be transformative, and that identity is a spectrum of choices, circumstances, and growth. In college, I found myself mentoring others, helping students navigate struggles, offering guidance with patience I had once lacked. I remembered the humiliation, the trembling hands, the first moments of walking in those unfamiliar clothes, and I used that memory to teach empathy. I understood fear in ways others could not, and I realized that sometimes the most unconventional methods produce the most profound growth. Even in social situations, I carried the lessons forward. I could face scrutiny, teasing, or judgment with composure, because I had learned what it meant to stand exposed and still endure. I had learned that true strength isn't about avoiding discomfort, it's about meeting it, understanding it, and using it to transform yourself. I had been tested in ways that felt extreme at the time, and yet those tests became the foundation for everything that came after. Sometimes, when life threw me into new and unfamiliar roles, presentations, interviews, social gatherings, I remembered the boy who had walked into class in a skirt and blouse, trembling but determined. I remembered every fear, every glance, every moment of awkwardness. And I realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. I had been trained, in the most unexpected way, to see my fears as tools rather than obstacles. Looking back now, I can see the entire journey clearly. What had started as a punishment, as a strange, humiliating challenge, had become the catalyst for self-discovery. I learned patience, grace, self-awareness, and resilience. I learned that identity is layered and adaptable, and that the courage to face discomfort can become the source of confidence that guides you for life. I had been forced to grow, and I had grown in ways I never imagined. I sometimes catch glimpses of that first reflection, the boy who didn't know who he was, staring into a mirror with uncertainty, fear, and embarrassment, and I feel gratitude. He had been vulnerable, exposed, and terrified, yet he endured. And because he endured, I became the person I am today. Aware, confident, empathetic, and ready to face the challenges life presents. The lesson stays with me. Growth often comes from unexpected, uncomfortable places. Transformation doesn't happen in comfort zones. It happens when you are challenged, when you are forced to confront yourself, and when you discover strength you didn't know you had. That semester with Ms. Hargrove, the skirts, the blouses, the trembling, and the lessons learned shaped the foundation of my adult self. And I carry it forward quietly, privately, yet powerfully, in everything I do. I smile now when I think about it, because I know the truth. The boy who feared humiliation and change became the man who embraces growth, curiosity, and courage. The transformation was never about clothing. It was about discovering the depths of myself and realizing that who I am is stronger, wiser, and more resilient than I ever imagined. And that knowledge is something no test, no teacher, no challenge can ever take away.